$4. That was the whole price. Not $4 a head, not $4 a pen, but $4 for the entire lot of them. 55 animals crowded into a corral behind the sale barn on the eastern edge of Culvert County. And Merritt Ashland counted them twice with her lips moving because the auctioneer had not bothered to. She stood at the rail in a canvas coat 2 sizes too big, watching goats that were mostly ribs and eyes, goats with cracked hooves and dull coats, and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from exhaustion. And she did not flinch when a man beside her spat into the dust and said loud enough for her to hear that a smart person would pay somebody to haul them off, not pay to take them home. The goats looked at her. She looked back. Behind her, the loudspeaker crackled through the last of the cattle, and the men in the stands laughed at something that had nothing to do with her. And the fee for the lot stayed at $4 because nobody else lifted a hand. And the clerk wrote her name down slow, spelling it wrong, and said, "Well, honey, they're yours now. God help you." She had not come there to buy goats. She had come to sell a broken chest freezer and a box of her late grandfather's tools. And she had ended up standing at that corral for 11 minutes, which the man who spat measured out loud like it was proof of something, saying you can stare all day, staring don't put meat on a bone. But Merritt had learned young that the things everybody agrees to ignore are usually the things worth a second look, and if you are watching this, and you have ever been the only one in the room who saw value where the crowd saw trash, do me a small kindness and tap that like button, and tell me in the comments the name of the town you're watching from, because I like to know where these stories land and who is out there listening. Now let me take you back, because to understand why a girl with almost no money paid $4 for 55 dying goats, you have to understand what she had lost and what she still had, and the one sentence her grandmother would say to her that changed the shape of everything. Merritt Ashland was 23 years old that autumn, and she had come back to the high dry country of central Culvert, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it might hold her. She had spent 3 years in the city working a register, and then a warehouse, and then a register again, and the money went out as fast as it came in, and the apartment she shared smelled like other people's cooking and other people's arguments, and one Tuesday she simply stopped. She did not quit dramatically. She just did not go back. Her grandfather had died that spring, a man named Orrin Delmar Ashland, who had run sheep and then cattle, and then almost nothing on 420 acres of thin soil and bunch grass off a gravel spur called Halter Ridge Road, and the place had come to her because there was no one else left to take it. Her mother had gone years before, to a city farther off than the one Merritt fled, and had made it clear over the phone that the ranch was a stone around the neck, that Merritt should sell it to a neighbor and be done. "Sell it," her mother said, "before it costs you what it cost the rest of us." But Merritt had driven the long way out anyhow, past the feed store in the town of Brannock Wells, past the single blinking light and the diner with the cracked sign, up the ridge to the house where the porch sagged and the barn leaned and the wind moved through everything like it owned the deed. She had meant to stay a week and clear it out. She stayed the week, and then another, and the leaving kept not happening. She slept in her grandfather's bed under a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of him, of leather and coffee and the mentholated rub he used on his shoulders, and in the mornings she walked the fence lines because there was nothing else to do, and the walking felt like the only thing that made sense. The land was not beautiful in the way the calendars want land to be. It was pale and stubborn, rolling up toward a rim of broken rock, dotted with juniper and sage and the gray skeletons of old fence posts, and everyone in Brannock Wells agreed it was played out, that Orrin had run it too hard for too long, that the topsoil was gone, and the springs were failing, and the only thing it could grow anymore was disappointment. Her grandfather's neighbor to the south, a big man named Ward Pruitt, who ran 900 head of cattle across a spread that made the Ashland place look like a garden patch, had already told her twice, kindly enough, that he'd take it off her hands for a fair price. that a young woman had no business trying to make a go of dead ground, that some places just aren't worth the trouble anymore. He said it the way a man states weather. It was not cruel. It was simply what everyone knew. But there was one person in Brannock Wells who did not say what everyone knew, and that was Merritt's great-aunt Ivadel, her grandfather's older sister, who was 87 that year and lived alone in a narrow house behind the church with a garden that produced more than any 3 people could eat. Ivadel Ashland wore men's work boots and a canvas apron and did not apologize for either, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her upright, and she spoke about as often as the well pump kicked on, which is to say only when there was a real reason. Merritt took to visiting her on Sundays, sitting on the back step shelling beans or holding a hank of yarn while the old woman wound it, and mostly they did not talk. But it was Ivadel who first said the thing that would not leave Merritt alone. They had been sitting in the low gold light of a September evening, and Merritt had been complaining gently, the way you complain to someone who won't coddle you, about how there was nothing the land could carry, how she'd priced cattle and couldn't afford 6, let alone 60, how the soil wouldn't take a crop without water she didn't have. And Ivadel had listened, and when Merritt finished, the old woman had looked out at the ridge for a long time and then said, flat as a board, the land will feed you what you're humble enough to accept. And that was all. She said it once and did not explain it, and went back to winding her yarn. And Merritt turned the sentence over in her mind for weeks, like a stone she'd picked up without meaning to. The land will feed you what you're humble enough to accept. Merritt did not know what it meant, not then, but she knew enough about her great-aunt to know it was not idle. So she went home and she opened the roll-top desk in the front room where her grandfather had kept his papers, and she began, slowly, going through the record of a life spent trying to make that ground pay. There were tax receipts and vet bills and photographs curled with age, and there were his notebooks, dozens of them, small and black, and filled with a hand so neat it was almost print. And Merritt sat on the floor of that cold room and read them by lamplight. And what she found in them was not a plan exactly, but a long, patient argument between a man and his land, an argument he had mostly lost, but not entirely. And in the margins of the last few years, there was a thread she almost missed, a set of entries where Orrin Ashland had written about goats. He had kept a few, it turned out, near the end, not for money, but almost out of curiosity, a small mixed band that he'd fenced onto the roughest quarter of the place, the brushy draw below the rim that no cow would touch and no sheep could climb. And in the notebooks he had written, in that neat hand, observations that read less like a rancher's ledger and more like the notes of a man who had finally started paying attention. The goats eat the cheat and the leafy spurge that's choke in the flats, he wrote. The goats browse the juniper sprouts before they take hold. Where the goats work, the grass comes back the following spring, thicker. And then, in an entry dated barely a year before he died, a line Merritt read 3 times. I was 50 years wrong about this ground. It doesn't want cattle. It wants something small and clever that eats what nobody else will. The old man had died before he could do much with the insight, but he had written it down, and now his granddaughter was sitting on the floor reading it, and outside the window the wind moved through the dead-looking bunchgrass, and something in Merritt went very quiet and very certain, the way it did when she saw a thing nobody else was looking at. She did not rush. That was never her way. She spent the next 2 months just learning, driving the 90 miles to the county library, reading everything they had on browse animals and rangeland, filling a notebook of her own, because if she was going to be a fool, she wanted to be an educated one. She learned that goats are browsers, not grazers, that they prefer the weeds and brush and woody sprouts that cattle and sheep leave behind, that on rough dry ground where cows would starve, goats could thrive if you understood them. She learned that their milk was different from cow's milk, higher in certain fats, easier for some people to drink, and that in the dry lands it had fed families through droughts that killed everything with hooves too big to climb rock. She learned that the small band her grandfather kept had been sold off after his death for almost nothing, scattered, gone. And she learned from a single line in an old rangeland bulletin that a herd of browsing goats run right could rebuild a piece of ruined ground faster and cheaper than any tractor or chemical, eating the invaders down, fertilizing as they went, letting the native grass breathe again. She read that line and she thought of the brushy draw below the rim, choked with spurge and juniper, and she thought, that is where I start. And so when she heard, through the woman who ran the gas station in Brannock Wells, a woman named Pearlie Cobb, who knew everything before it happened, that a rancher 2 counties over had gone under and his creditors were dumping his whole failed goat operation at the Culvert sale barn. 55 head nobody wanted. Merritt put on her grandfather's canvas coat and drove down to look. She had known, standing at that corral, that the animals were in bad shape. She was not blind. They had been neglected in the collapse of their owners' fortunes, underfed, wormy, their hooves gone long, and half the county would have called them worthless and been able to point at each rib as proof. But Merritt stood at the rail for 11 minutes, and she did not see 55 dying goats. She saw 55 animals that were still standing, which meant they were tougher than their condition, and she saw among them several does with the deep barrel and the good udder that even in their thinness told her they had milk in them or would again. And she saw a breeding-age buck with a clear eye, and she did the arithmetic her grandfather had taught her without teaching her, the arithmetic of what a thing could become rather than what it was. The man beside her, the one who spat, was Delton Sarnes, who leased grazing from Ward Pruitt and considered himself a judge of livestock. And he told her plainly, as a fact offered for her consideration, that she'd be burying most of that lot inside a month and feeding the survivors money she didn't have. That goats were a nuisance and goat's milk was for people who couldn't afford a cow. That this whole idea, whatever it was, led exactly nowhere. Nowhere, he said again, tasting the word. Merritt paid her $4. She borrowed a stock trailer from a man who owed her grandfather a favor and had not known Orrin was dead until she told him. And she hauled 55 starving goats up Halter Ridge Road to a place everyone agreed could not even feed itself. The first winter nearly proved Delton Sarnes right, and Merritt would not have blamed anyone for saying so, though nobody had to say it because the whole town was already saying it at the counter of Pearlie Cobb's gas station and the tables of the diner and the loading dock of the feed store in Brannock Wells, where a man named Hollis Trant kept the register and kept, as well, a running commentary on the foolishness of the Ashland girl who'd hauled home a trailer of dead men walking. She lost 4 goats in the first 2 weeks, the weakest ones, the ones too far gone to pull back, and each one she buried herself at the top of the draw with a spade in the frozen ground, and each grave took her a long time and she did not hurry it. But she did not lose a 5th. She had spent nearly the last of her money not on the goats, but on what the goats needed, on wormer and a mineral tub and good alfalfa hay hauled in on a borrowed flatbed. And she had spent something that cost nothing but was rarer than money, which was attention. She was out among them before light and after dark. She learned their faces. She kept a notebook, her own now, filling it the way her grandfather had filled his, noting which doe favored which patch, which one led and which ones followed, which of them coughed and which had cleared. She trimmed 50-odd sets of overgrown hooves one at a time, kneeling in the mud with the animal's leg braced against her thigh, her hands cracking in the cold, and she talked to them low while she worked, not because she believed they understood, but because it steadied them, and it steadied her. By February, the survivors had begun to change. It was slow, the way real things are slow, but their coats were coming in, and the deep-barreled does were rounding out, and Merritt could see when she ran her hands along their spines that the ribs were disappearing under a layer of what her grandfather would have called condition. Ivadel came out once, in February, riding along when the pastor's wife drove up the ridge to deliver a casserole, and the old woman stood at the fence in her men's boots and looked at the goats a long time without speaking. And Merritt stood beside her and did not fill the silence. Finally, Ivadel said, "Your grandfather kept a few of these, down in the draw." Merritt said she knew, that she'd read it in his books. The old woman nodded slowly. He said the same thing about them. "You're going to find out," she said. Merritt asked what that was. Ivadel looked at the ridge. "That the ones nobody wants will carry you through the year nobody sees coming," she said. And then she got back in the car, because the cold was in her joints, and she had said what she came to say. And Merritt stood at the fence turning that over too, not knowing yet that the year nobody saw coming was already on its way, gathering itself out over the dry high plains to the west like a held breath. That spring the does kidded, and Merritt learned midwifery the way she learned everything, by staying up and paying attention and failing a little and getting better fast. She lost 2 kids and saved 19, and by the middle of April the draw below the rim was full of a sound that Ridge had not heard in years, the high complaining bleat of young goats. And Merritt found that she stood at the fence in the evenings just to listen to it. But the sound was not the point, or it was not the only point. The point was what came after the kidding, which was milk. The does were fresh and heavy with it, more than the kids could take. And Merritt remembered the line in the old Rangeland Bulletin and the entries in her grandfather's notebooks. And one gray morning she carried a clean pail down to the draw, and she caught the calmest of the does, a broad tan animal with a white blaze that she had taken to calling Ledger, because the doe was always first in line and always watching, as though keeping accounts. And Merritt sat down on an upturned bucket and did what her grandfather had done and his mother before him. And after a clumsy start the milk came, hissing into the pail, warm and sweet-smelling in the cold air. And Merritt looked at it a long time before she stood up. It was not much. It was a start. It was, she understood, standing there with a pail of milk on a piece of ground the whole county had written off, the first thing this land had produced for anyone in longer than she'd been alive. She did not tell anyone. She was not ready to be laughed at over a pail of milk, and she wanted to understand the thing before she spoke about it, which was her nature, and had been since she was small. So through that spring she milked her best does morning and evening, and she taught herself to make things from it, working from a stained old book she'd found in the kitchen that had belonged to her grandmother, whom she had never met, a woman named Cleona, who had died young and left behind recipes in a looping hand for soft cheeses and cultured butter, and a tangy fresh curd that the book called simply the Ridge cheese. Merritt's first attempts were failures she fed to the pigs she didn't have, and then to the chickens she did. But she kept a record of every batch, temperatures and times, and what went wrong. And by June she had made a small round of soft cheese that did not disgust her. And by July she had made one that she caught herself eating, standing up at the counter with a spoon, and she thought, if I like it this much, someone else will. That was the whole of her marketing philosophy, then and always. Make something so good that a person who tastes it has to tell another person. Let the thing sell itself. Refuse to beg for it. Her grandfather had written a version of that too, in one of the notebooks, in an entry that had nothing to do with goats. A good thing don't need a loud man to sell it. It needs one honest mouth to taste it and one more to hear about it. Merritt copied that line onto the first page of her own notebook, and under it she wrote nothing, because there was nothing to add. The first honest mouth belonged to Pearlie Cobb at the gas station, and it happened almost by accident, which is how the true things usually start. Merritt had stopped for fuel in July with a cooler in the back of the truck, on her way to nowhere in particular, and Pearlie, who could smell a story the way other people smelled rain, had asked what was in the cooler, and Merritt, who did not lie even when it would have been easier, said cheese she'd made from her goats. Pearlie's eyebrows went up into her permed gray hair, because everyone knew the Ashland girls' goats were a doomed venture, and she said, "Well, let me taste this cheese that's going to save your ranch," in a voice that had a smile behind it but not a mean one. And Merritt cut her a piece with the pocket knife that had been her grandfather's and handed it across the counter on a paper towel, and Pearlie Cobb put it in her mouth expecting to be polite about it. She was not polite about it. She stopped talking, which for Pearlie was a kind of miracle, and she looked at the little wedge in her hand as though it had lied about being cheese. And then she said, "Honey, where has this been?" And Merritt said, "On a ranch nobody thinks can grow anything." And Pearlie cut herself another piece without asking, and then a third, and then she bought the whole round Merritt had brought, $4 for it, which Merritt noticed and did not mention, the same $4 she'd paid for her 55 goats, now coming back to her for one small round of cheese, and she drove home turning that over too, thinking that maybe her grandfather and her great-aunt were right, that the land would feed her what she was humble enough to accept, and that she had been humble enough to accept goats when the whole county laughed. Pearlie Cobb was, as it happened, the most efficient marketing engine in 3 counties, and she went to work without being asked. By August, Merritt was making 8 small rounds a week and could have sold 20 because Pearlie told everyone who bought gas, and the gas station was where everyone in Brannock Wells eventually stood, and the ranchers' wives who bought the cheese told the ranchers, and the diner bought a wheel to crumble over their Friday special, and the special stopped being about the trout and started being about the cheese. Merritt raised her price, not because she was greedy, but because she kept selling out, which she understood from her grandfather's notebooks meant the price was too low, and even doubled it sold as fast as she could make it. She was still doing everything by hand, milking morning and evening, straining and culturing on the cold slate counter of her grandmother's kitchen, and she was tired in the good way that has an end you can see, and for the first time since she'd come back up the ridge, she stopped thinking about leaving. She thought about the herd instead, which she was slowly building, keeping the best doe kids, and she thought about the draw below the rim, which she had noticed, walking it in August, was already different. The leafy spurge chewed down to nothing where the goats worked, the juniper sprouts gone, and under the browsed-off brush, so faint you had to kneel to see it, new grass, thin and green, coming up through ground everyone said was dead. She knelt and touched it and did not tell anyone about that either. Some things you keep until they're strong enough to speak for themselves. Delton Sarnes came around in September, which was the first crack in the wall of conventional certainty, though he did not come to admit anything. He came to buy cheese for his wife, who had tasted it at the diner and would not stop talking about it, and he stood in Merritt's kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand looking at the neat rows of rounds curing on the racks she'd built, and he did not know how to be there, a man who had told a girl to her face that her whole idea led nowhere now, standing in the middle of the nowhere buying its product. He paid for 2 rounds and cleared his throat and said, "Well, these are all right," in the strangled voice of a man conceding a point he'd rather die than name. And Merritt took his money and said, "Thank you," and did not make him say more, because she had learned from Ivadel that you do not need to win the argument out loud when the facts are winning it for you. But at the door he stopped and turned and said the thing he'd actually come to say, which was that Ward Pruitt's south pasture was so choked with brush the cattle couldn't get through it, and that Pruitt had been cussing about the cost of clearing it, and that maybe, Delton said, maybe those weed-eating goats of yours could do something with it, if you were of a mind, and there'd be pay in it. Merritt looked at him a long moment, the way she looked at everything before she moved. Then she said she'd think on it, and she shut the door and stood in her grandmother's kitchen with the smell of curing cheese all around her, and she thought that the man who'd told her the goats led nowhere had just offered to pay her to bring them onto the biggest ranch in the county, and that her grandfather had written it down a year before he died. It doesn't want cattle. It wants something small and clever that eats what nobody else will. She took the job that autumn. and it was the second stream from the same clever animals, because Merritt had understood by then a thing that no one who mocked her had bothered to see, which was that her goats were not one business but two braided together, milk from the front of them and land work from their appetites, and that the two fed each other, the browsing keeping the animals fed and healthy at almost no cost, while their milk paid the bills, and their labor healed the ground and earned a second wage from neighbors who'd once laughed. She fenced the herd temporarily onto Ward Pruitt's brush-choked south pasture with portable netting she paid for out of cheese money, and she moved them across it in a slow rotation she'd worked out from her grandfather's notes in her library reading. So they ate the brush down without wrecking the good grass, and within 3 weeks that pasture was open enough for cattle to walk through it, and Ward Pruitt, who had spent his whole life certain that the Ashland ground and the Ashland girl were both a waste of good country, stood at his own fence and watched 50-odd goats do in 3 weeks what a hired crew had quoted him $4,000 in a month to do, and he paid Merritt for the work without much conversation, because he was not a man who found words easily when he was wrong. But she saw it in his face, and she did not gloat, because Ivadel had taught her without teaching her that gloating is what people do when they aren't sure they've won, and Merritt was sure. Word of the brush clearing traveled the same way the cheese had, mouth to mouth at the gas station and the feed store and the church, and by the time the first hard frost came, a rancher on the far side of the county had called about his own choked draws, and Merritt's notebook filled with names, and she had not spent $1 on advertising because she never would. The winter that followed was the year nobody saw coming, and it did not come as cold. It came as dry. The snows that should have filled the high country never fell, or fell thin and blew off, and the men at the feed store who had spent a season half admitting the Ashland girl might be onto something went quiet in a different way, watching the sky, because a rancher learns to read a dry winter the way a sailor reads a low sky, and what they read frightened them. By the time the spring came that should have greened the country, it did not green. The grass came up stunted and then stopped. The stock ponds shrank to cracked rings of mud. The springs that the whole valley leaned on, including the failing ones on Ward Pruitt's spread, dropped, and by June the county was in the worst drought anyone under 70 could remember, and Ivadel, who was over 70 by a good deal, said only that she'd seen its like once, as a girl, and that it had emptied half the valley of people who never came back. The big cattle operations were hit hardest, because a cow needs a great deal of grass and a great deal of water, and there was neither, and Ward Pruitt began selling off cattle at a loss because he could not feed them, and Delton Sarnes lost his lease because there was nothing to graze on it, and the diner cut its hours, and the feed store extended credit it knew it might never collect, and a low grinding fear settled over Brannock Wells like dust settling after a truck goes by. But up on Halter Ridge Road, on the 420 acres of thin ground that the whole county had agreed was worthless, the goats were fine. They were more than fine, because goats are browsers, and browse is what survives a drought, the woody brush and the deep-rooted weeds and the tough shrubs that stay green when the grass is quit. And while the cattle starved on the good bottom land, the goats thrived on the rough high draws that no cow could ever use, walking the brush lines, eating the very plants that a wetter year would have made worthless. And because they thrived, they milked. That was the thing Merritt had read about in the old bulletin and half believed and now watched come true with her own eyes. The thing her grandmother Cleona had known when she wrote out the Ridge cheese recipe in her lupin hand. The thing the dry country people had always known and the fat year people had always forgotten, which was that when the drought hits and the big animals fail, the milk of the small clever ones is the last thing standing between a family and a hungry year. Merritt's does gave milk all through that terrible summer, warm and sweet into the pail every morning while the county went brown around her, and she made her grandmother's cheese and her cultured butter and the tangy fresh curd. and there was more demand for it than ever, because it was one of the few things still being produced by anything on four legs for 50 miles. And Merritt sold every ounce and could have sold triple. She did something then that the men at the feed store told and retold for years afterward, not because it made her rich, which it did not, but because it told them who she was. When Ward Pruitt's wife came up the ridge in July, then faced with the worry that was on everyone to buy cheese, Merritt sold it to her at the same price she'd charged the year before, though she could have doubled it, and the woman would have paid. And when Pearlie Cobb told her she was a fool to leave money on the table in a drought, Merritt said only that a price that takes advantage of a hard year is a price you have to look at every good year after. She kept the price steady. And more than that, when the worst of it came in August, and there were families in the valley genuinely going short, Merritt began quietly leaving rounds of cheese and jars of butter on certain porches without a word and without a bill. The porches of the families she knew were hurting worst, and she never spoke of it, and neither did they. And it was Iva Dell, of all people, who let it slip to the pastor's wife that the Ashland girl was feeding half the ridge for free out of goats she'd paid $4 for, and by the time that story reached the feed store, the men who had laughed at her did not laugh any more. They stood in the dusty light of the failing summer, and they looked at each other, and Hollis Trant, who had kept up the running commentary on her foolishness for 2 years behind his register, said what several of them were thinking, which was that the girl had seen something the whole county missed, and that her dead grandfather had seen it before her, and that maybe the ground up on Halter Ridge had never been worthless at all, but only misunderstood. Ward Pruitt came up the ridge himself in September, at the tail end of the drought, when the first real rain in 14 months had finally fallen, and the whole county stood out in it like people who'd forgotten what water was. He came in his good truck, and he parked it by the leaning barn, and he walked out to the fence where Merritt was moving the netting, and he stood there a while the way people did on that ridge, saying nothing, watching the goats. He was a big man made smaller by a hard year, and he had sold off 2/3 of his cattle and taken on debt he'd spend the rest of his life paying, and he had come to say something, and he took his time getting to it. Finally, he said that he'd been wrong about the place, and that he'd been wrong about her, and that he'd said things a couple years back at the sale barn and around town that he wished he hadn't, and he did not make a large production out of it, because that was not the kind of man he was, and Merritt did not make him grovel, because that was not the kind of woman she was. She said she appreciated him saying so. Then Ward Pruitt asked her, plainly, how she'd known. And Merritt thought about it, standing in the light rain with the goats moving behind her, and she said that she hadn't known, not really, that her grandfather had known and written it down, and she'd just been humble enough to read it. It doesn't want cattle, she said, quoting the notebook. It wants something small and clever that eats what nobody else will. And Ward Pruitt nodded slowly. A man who had run cattle on that country for 40 years, hearing the sentence that explained his whole failed fight with it, and he said, Orrin was smarter than the rest of us. He was just 50 years early. And then he asked if she'd bring her goats down onto his place come spring to eat back the brush that had crept in while he was distracted with dying cattle, and to keep it eaten on a standing arrangement. And Merritt said she'd think on it, which by now everyone knew meant yes. And the two of them stood at the fence in the rain a while longer without needing to say anything more. The years after that were not dramatic, because Merritt did not build dramatically. And if you had come up Halter Ridge Road expecting to find that the girl with the $4 goats had become a rich woman with a gleaming operation, you'd have been disappointed, and she'd have been glad to disappoint you. She built the way her grandfather had told her to build, small and steady and without debt she couldn't see the end of, letting the demand pull the growth instead of borrowing against a growth she hoped would come. She grew the herd slowly, keeping her best does, culling honestly, until she had 100 and then 150 animals, enough to run 2 milking strings and 3 brush crews, and she took on a helper, a quiet teenage boy from a family down the valley named Emmett Roush, whose people had lost most of what they had in the drought. And she taught him the way Ivadel had taught her, which was mostly by working beside him and saying little and letting him watch. She built a proper milk room off the kitchen, cinder block and clean, and she got the licenses and the inspections, doing it all a step at a time as the money allowed and never a step before. And she named the operation, when she finally put a name on the labels, the Ridge Cheese, after the entry in her grandmother's recipe book, because it seemed right that the name should come from the woman who'd known this all along and died before she could prove it. The cheese went from the gas station and the diner to a grocery in the county seat, and then to 2 restaurants in the city 90 miles off, whose chefs had tasted it and, exactly as her grandfather had written, told other chefs, one honest mouth to the next. And Merritt never once bought an advertisement or hired a salesman, and she turned away accounts she couldn't supply without growing faster than she wanted to grow. And the ones she turned away only wanted her more. Ivadel lived to see most of it, which was a mercy, and she came up the ridge on Sundays for as long as her legs would carry her there, and then had herself driven. And she would sit in the milk room on a stool Merritt kept for her and watch the work with her old hands folded in her lap, saying almost nothing, the way she always had. She was there the day the letter came from a farm magazine wanting to write about the young woman who'd rebuilt dead ground with goats. And Merritt read it aloud, and Ivadel listened with her eyes closed, and then said only, "They'll get it wrong, they always do." And she was right, because the article when it came out made it sound like a plan Merritt had hatched, a clever strategy, when the truth was so much slower and stranger than that. The truth being that a tired girl had come home with nowhere else to go, and had been humble enough to read a dead man's notebooks and to pay $4 for what everyone else called garbage, and then to pay attention for a long time without needing to be right in front of anyone. Ivadel died the following winter, in her narrow house behind the church, in her sleep at 89. And Merritt found her because she'd gone to bring her a round of the Ridge cheese, and she sat with her a while before she called anyone, holding the old cold hand, and she did not cry until later, alone, up on the ridge, standing at the fence in the dark, with the goats moving quiet in the pen. Ivadel had left her everything, which was not much in the way of money, and was everything in the way of the things that mattered. The recipe book's twin she'd never known existed, and the men's work boots, and a note in the old woman's blunt hand that Merritt found in the recipe book, a single line that said, "You were the one who listened," and Merritt put that note in the front of her own notebook next to her grandfather's line about the honest mouth, and she kept it there always. The place is still there, up Halter Ridge Road in Culvert County, and the ground that the whole valley agreed was played out is the greenest high country for miles now. Not because Merritt forced it to be, but because she let the small clever animals heal it the way her grandfather had seen they could. And the draw below the rim where he'd kept his first few goats and where she'd buried the 4 that didn't make that first winter is thick with native grass now, waving in the wind that still moves through everything like it owns the deed. Only now what it moves through is alive. Merritt Ashland is in her 30s, and she runs the Ridge Cheese and the Brush Cruise, and she has never taken on debt she couldn't see the bottom of, and she has never once had to argue with anyone that her goats were worth something, because reality made the argument for her, slowly, the way it does. And the same men who told her the whole idea led nowhere now send their sons up the ridge to work for her in the summers and call her operation the smartest thing to happen to Culvert County in 50 years. She still keeps a notebook. She still stands and looks at a thing a long time before she moves. And every so often she drives down to the sale barn on the eastern edge of the county, not to buy anything, just to stand at that same corral rail where she once counted 55 starving goats twice with her lips moving. And she remembers the $4, and she remembers Delton Sarn saying the word nowhere like he was tasting it, and she thinks about how the land fed her exactly what she was humble enough to accept, which turned out to be everything. If this story reached something in you, do me a favor and send it to somebody who's been told that what they have or what they are or what they're holding on to isn't worth the trouble. Because sometimes the only thing a person needs is to hear about someone who was told the very same thing and turned out to be right. And I'd truly like to know, down in the comments, about a time you saw worth in something everybody else had written off, whether it paid off or not, because it matters either way. Tell me, too, where you're watching from, the town, the county, the country, wherever this found you tonight, because I read every single comment that comes in on these, every one. And there is something about knowing where all of you are sitting out there in the dark that makes the telling feel less like talking to a screen and more like sitting on a porch step at dusk with the wind coming down off the ridge, shelling beans, saying little, watching the light go gold and knowing, the way Merritt came to know and the way her grandfather knew before her, that the things the world is quickest to call worthless are so often the very things that carry us through the year nobody sees coming. What I did not tell you, and what Merritt rarely tells anyone, is what she found in the last of her grandfather's notebooks, the one she did not open until after Ivadel was gone, because it had been slid down behind the others in the roll-top desk, and she had missed it that first winter by lamplight. It was thinner than the rest, and its final entry was dated the week before he died, and in that neat hand gone shaky at the end, Orrin Ashland had written not about grass or browse or the Phelan Springs, but about her. The girl will come back, he wrote. She won't have a plan. Nobody who comes back ever does. But she watches. She watched everything as a child and said nothing. And that is the one thing this ground needs that I could never teach a soul, only wait for. Leave her the notebooks. She'll read them when she's humble enough, and not one day before. Merritt sat on the floor of that cold front room the way she had 2 years earlier, and she read those lines by the same lamp, and this time she did cry. Quietly, the way she did everything, because the man had known. He had known she would come, and he had known why, and he had planted the whole thing in ink and waited to be right long after he was gone, the way the seed of native grass will lie in dead-looking ground for years, holding until something small and clever comes along and eats back what was choking it and lets the light down at last. She keeps that notebook separate now, wrapped in a square of oilcloth in the drawer of the milk room, and on the mornings when the work is hard or a dough is down or the second guessing creeps in, the way it does even for people who have been proven right, she takes it out and reads that one entry and puts it back. Emmett Roush has his own herd now on his family's rebuilt place down the valley, and he learned it the way she did, by watching and saying little. And last spring he named his best doe Ledger without knowing why the name felt right, only that Merritt had told him once that the first doe she ever milked had a white blaze and always stood first in line, keeping accounts. That is how the thing moves now, quiet and sideways, from an old man to a tired girl to a quiet boy, none of them loud, none of them selling anything, each of them just humble enough to accept what the land was offering, which was never much on the surface and was everything underneath. The wind still comes down off the rim at dusk. The goats still gather at the fence, and somewhere in the sound of them, if you stand there long enough and say nothing, you can almost hear a man who was 50 years early being proven at last exactly on time.